Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our third Irish American Heritage Month webinar. I'm Danny O'Connell, AOH President, and today we will discuss the Irish and the American Civil War. Our guest speaker is historian and author, Damien Shields from County Cork, originally from Limerick, I believe. On our panel today is Liam McNabb, National Treasurer, Jer Cole, our National Secretary and the only member of the National Board that remembers the Civil War. Sean Penn, National Vice President, Judge James McKay, past President, Neil Cosgrove, Irish American Heritage Month Chairman, and really the person who put this whole month together for us. Our moderator today is Daniel Taylor, our national historian who's done a great job with each of these webinars. Take it away, Dan.
Thank you, Danny. As Ireland suffered through the Great Hunger, an historic event of another sort was in the offing here in the United States. 1850 saw the sixth successive failure of the potato crop in Ireland. Americans will remember from their school days the year 1850 as being the year of the Compromise of 1850, with the compromise being the admission of new free states and territories to the north and slave states to the south. As Irish immigrants poured into the United States, the tensions between North and South persisted until the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 made war inevitable. Irish immigrants and first and second generation Irish Americans played an outsized role in the war when it did come. And perhaps surprisingly for a people steeped in their own history, known for their collective memory, the role of the Irish in our Civil War is not as well known in Ireland as one might imagine. Our guest today has made it his life's work to document, preserve, and make known the remarkable role played by Irish immigrants and their children in our Civil War. Damien Shields is a prolific historian and archaeologist. Formerly a curator with the National Museum of Ireland, Damien is the creator and proprietor of a remarkable website and blog, now in its 11th year, called the Irish and American Civil War, which you can find at irishamericancivilwar.com, one word. The website is just a remarkable collection of scholarly articles, artifacts, videos, and all manner of information that tell this remarkable story. Included in Damien's many publications are his books from 2016, The Forgotten Irish, Irish Immigrant Experiences in America. Also from 2016, being a proud Corkman, he is the author of the Heritage Centenary Sites of Rebel County Cork. And in 2013, of course, the Irish in the American Civil War. Damien's research in recent years has been focused on his review and analysis of a trove of letters contained within 19th century American widow and dependent pension applications that were written by Irish men who served in our Civil War. In fact, just last month, Damien earned his PhD from Northumbria University, successfully defending his doctoral thesis, which was entitled Recovering the Voices of the Union Irish, Identity, Motivation, and Experience in Irish American Civil War Correspondence, 1861 to 1865. And with that, we are pleased to welcome Damien Shields.
Thanks a million, Dan. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the invite to speak to you all today. I'll just try and share my screen now, and hopefully it will all go off without a hitch. So hopefully everybody can see it. Yeah, great. Okay, well, as I say, thanks so much for the invite to chat to you all today. I suppose what I'm going to discuss is kind of a talk of two parts. So I want to try and give a general overview of Irish involvement in the American Civil War, both for the North and for the South during the conflict, and take up the first half, maybe talking about some of the major figures, some of the kind of major themes. And then, as Dan was saying there, I spend a lot of my time trying to look at the social history of the working kind of class Irish Americans, the guys who were in the ranks in the Union military. And I spend a lot of time on these widows' pension files that actually are the most extraordinary trove of 19th century social information about the Irish people that exists anywhere in the world, including Ireland. But I'm going to spend the second half of the talk discussing some of the outputs of that, some of the information I've come up with on that, just with a particular focus on religion, and also having a look at just a few kind of particularly interesting and informative individual personal stories. Okay? But to start then, I always refer in an Irish context, and Danny and Dan were alluding to this at the start, that the American Civil War doesn't get an awful lot of airtime in Ireland. Obviously, it gets a huge amount of time in the United States, the Irish involvement, as it should. But it doesn't get much airtime in Ireland, and I believe that it should do. And I always refer to it as Ireland's forgotten Great War. Particularly in recent years, we've had an awful lot of discussion and analysis of Irish participation in the First World War. But the American Civil War is the only conflict in our modern history where the numbers in service were comparable. And in fact, for many places in Ireland, there were more people who fought in the American Civil War in terms of numbers than in the First World War. And it all comes down to the figures we're talking about. Dan was mentioning the famine immigration in the 1840s and the 1850s. That meant that by the dawn of the American Civil War, 1.6 million Irish-born people were living in the United States of America. So this is the pool of individuals who are going to go on and serve in the Union and Confederate militaries. The numbers then, when you start to drill down, are absolutely staggering. So if you were walking along the streets of New York City, or even if you were in Manhattan, 1 in 4 New Yorkers are Irish-born. In Manhattan, it's way higher than that at the time of the American Civil War. And as many of you will know, New York sends the most men in the Union military to the front. So there's very few New York urban units, for example, that don't have Irish spread throughout them. And the numbers have suffered somewhat in relation to the Irish experience of the war, in that they have been long underestimated. I won't go into the in-depth details of it, but there was a misreading of a source from the 19th century that has meant that the numbers of Irishmen who served has been understated, and has led to some discussion that the Irish, in fact, weren't represented by their percentage of the population in the American Civil War. I've done a reanalysis of these figures, and it actually demonstrates that they almost certainly were overrepresented in the military. And when you look at it in the round, we can say that 200,000 Irish-born men served in the American Civil War, either for the Union or the Confederate. As we'll see now, the vast bulk of these men are serving in the US forces during the conflict, but around 200,000 Irish-born men. And as many of you will be aware, the Irish were chain migrants in many respects. They differ, for example, from the Germans, the other great immigrant group of the period in this. So the Irish often spent days, months, years, sometimes even decades in countries like England, and Scotland, and Canada before they got to the United States. And particularly in the work I've been doing, what you find is an awful lot of men who were born. So that if you look at a roster from the Civil War, you might see someone called Murphy who's born in Canada or England or Scotland. These guys almost certainly saw themselves as Irish or Irish American because of the way they grew up in Irish communities abroad. And so you have a huge swathe of these guys who are serving as well, the children of Irish immigrants. The Irish lead the way in terms of foreign-born men who become generals. 18 Irish become generals during the American Civil War. 32 become brevet generals, which many of you will be familiar with. This is a specifically United States military term. Often during the war, it was given, a brevet command was given in order to get someone to command troops at a general level without having to pay them that money. Because they didn't want to actually confirm them in the rank. And it was given as a kind of an honorary title for people who perform good service at the end of the conflict as well. I do quite a bit of work on the Medal of Honor, and it might surprise you to learn that we actually do not know for certain how many men who were born in Ireland received the Medal of Honor during the American Civil War. Partly because of an issue in relation to nativity being incorrectly entered on military documentation when men enlisted. But at least 146 Irish-born men received the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. 2 of them I added because of my own work on this, of guys who it had been said they'd been born in the United States, but were actually born in Ireland. An area that really needs an awful lot of work, but very interesting story about all of these guys. So again, you see this huge number, and that is also the highest foreign-born numbers in terms of the Medal of Honor. It's probably the American Civil War, the biggest Irish experience of naval warfare in history as well. 1 in 5 or 20% of the Union Navy was Irish born. And you have lots of guys who are leaving Ireland. I have a particularly great story of a a very distressed woman in Dublin whose husband goes on a sailing cruise across the Atlantic. And the next letter she hears from him is saying, oh, by the way, I've joined the Union Navy. And he spends the next couple of years serving in the Union Navy while his wife stays in Dublin. So you get a lot of guys leaving Ireland, and professional sailors who are serving in the Union Navy. We're never going to know, because of the records, how many Irish died. Irish-born died. We'll never know how many Irish ethnics died in the war, but Irish-born, based on our known rates of death of the Confederate and Union forces, it's likely that somewhere between 25 and 35,000 Irish-born men lost their lives in the war, creating an incredible wave of misery for dozens and dozens of families. That is much higher in proportion than that figure. And as I was saying, it's the largest war in history for many Irish counties. So, for example, for the province of Munster, where I'm talking to you from the shores of Cork Harbour today, for a lot of the west coast, for places in the northwest, like Donegal, these places that saw huge immigration out of Ireland in the 1840s and 1850s, it's by far the biggest conflict in terms of numbers that any of those counties have ever had, is the service in the American Civil War. So hugely important, hugely influential, something that you're well aware of in the United States, something I think we need to be a bit more aware of in an Irish context. Okay? So just to kind of give a very broad overview of the two sides then. The Union Irish, so of that 200,000 Irish born I was talking about who served in the war, 180,000 of them are fighting for the Union. All right, that's a massive. You can see that the story really is overwhelmingly one of guys fighting in the north, and we'll see the main reason for that in a minute. As I was pointing out, there's vast numbers as well of children of Irish immigrants. So the estimate that I have come up with is in and around 70,000 children of Irish immigrants. So you can see when you add those two figures together that the probable degree of service of ethnic Irish people in the Union forces during the American Civil War is in the region of 250,000 men. So the number you'll often see, in fact, before I did this research in my first book, I went by the standard number. You will usually see 150,000 as the figure given for Irish service in the United States. You can see the difference, realizing that there was probably 250,000 ethnic Irishmen fighting in the war makes to your perceptions, both in terms of how many were serving and their influence across the military. So Irish service in the Union forces, although they did serve in large numbers in the West, it is overwhelmingly focused on the East and the Eastern theatre because of the areas that these men are serving out of. More than double the number of Irish volunteers leave from the state of New York than anywhere else. The next biggest is Pennsylvania, and then Illinois and Massachusetts are coming in around the same levels as third. So the bulk of New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts troops serve in the East. They serve in armies like the Army of the Potomac. So that's why places like Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Antietam are really overwhelmingly linked with the Irish experience, as opposed to some of the Western battles. Okay. Of the brigades, there are two ethnic brigades. So these aren't going to need much introduction, I would suspect, particularly the first one, the Irish Brigade, the most famous, the most important Irish unit of the war. It's a very interesting unit because it's dominated all the history of the war from an Irish perspective ever since, but it dominated it at the time as well. It was the thing that everyone mentioned. And I was mentioning that I'm doing a lot of work on letters from ordinary guys in the Civil War. So if an Irish guy was serving in a non-ethnic unit somewhere down in Virginia and the Irish Brigade wanders past the road, past him, he talks about that at home. They all talk about it. They talk about hearing about Mar. They talk about the performance of the Irish Brigade, even if they're not serving in that brigade. It's seen as a hugely important marker of the Irish experience, both during the war and after it, obviously. So initially, that brigade has 3 New York units in it, the 63rd, the 69th, and the 88th New York. And just before the Battle of Fredericksburg, it's joined by the 28th Massachusetts and 116th Pennsylvania. But that's kind of its historic, famed grouping, if you like. And obviously, at places like Antietam, at Fredericksburg, it is utterly decimated, in effect destroyed. There's by the time they get to Gettysburg, they have very low numbers, and they effectively need to be reconstituted after that. The other one that doesn't get as much play is Corcoran's Irish Legion. So the pictures on the right, by the way, are Thomas Francis Marr at the top, the leader of the Irish Brigade, the 1848 young Irelander. and credited with the design of the Irish flag, bringing it back from France, and who commanded the Irish Brigade, initially formed it. The guy below him is Michael Corcoran, who formed Corcoran's Irish Legion. This was an entirely New York-based New York regiments in this unit. Corcoran, if anything, probably had an even bigger reputation than Marr among the ordinary New York Irish. And his unit has a lot of guys who actually stayed out of the Irish Brigade because they were waiting for Corcoran to be released from prison. He'd been captured with the 69th New York State Militia at Bull Run. He was the colonel at the time and had been held in Confederate prisons until later in 1862. And when he came out to much fanfare, he was given a brigadier general rank and forms Corcoran's Legion. He died in a fall from his horse in Virginia in late 1863, before his brigade had ever seen any really major service. They were based a lot around Suffolk at that time. But after his death, the brigade were moved to the Army of the Potomac. And in 1864, during the Overland Campaign, which is probably the campaign in the American Civil War that saw more Irish Americans die than any other, the Corcoran's Legion is absolutely decimated in places like Cold Harbor and around Petersburg. It's very heavily Fenian as well. There are a lot of Fenians in the Irish Brigade, but there are probably more Fenians in Corcoran's Irish Legion. A lot of them try and hold on and join in that brigade. So they're the two most consequential units, if you like, groupings of regiments, those two ethnic Irish brigades. The Irish do not serve like the Germans do in huge numbers together. The Germans are much more cohesive in the Union military. Many of you will be familiar with the 11th Corps, for example, which is a distinctly German flavor, who got blamed for defeats at Chancellorsville, unfairly so, really, but with a correlating impact on the German reputation in America. The Irish don't serve together in those units to the same extent in those ethnic units. They're much more spread around. Okay, but even so, there are an awful lot of these ethnic, what I call green flag regiments from an awful lot of states. So, you know, you can take your pick nearly. The 69th Pennsylvania Infantry, named in honor of the 69th New York, who defend the angle at Gettysburg against Pickett's charge. That's where they meet their eternal glory. 23rd Illinois, Mulligan's Irish Brigade, another really famous green flag unit. So they're spread and dotted around an awful lot of the states in the north. But the great bulk of the Irish, and this is actually what I concentrate most of my work on, do not serve in those units. They serve in 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s in company units. They serve in 2s, 3s, and 4s in units where they're joining in with a couple of members of their family. All right, so that's the majority Irish experience of the American Civil War. As I was pointing out, 20% of the Union Navy were men of Irish birth, and 12 of those 18 Union generals were Irish born. So, and again, just recapping on those numbers, New York is the really dominant story. So any battlefield you ever see where New York had a bad day, I often think of the Battle of Second Bull Run or Second Manassas, where large New York units are charging the railroad cut. That was a very bad day for Irish America. Doesn't get as much play as things like Fredericksburg and stuff, but anywhere where you come across those big urban units from Philly, from Boston as well, it's a similar story. Always bad days for Irish America. All right. So the Confederate Irish then. The most comprehensive analysis has been carried out by Professor David Gleason, who's done a really, really good analysis of numbers. And he's come up with the 20,000 figure in Confederate forces, which is lower than some of the historic estimates, but in fact, it's a very high proportion of the Irish population in the South. They're serving at a very high degree in comparison to the numbers that there were in the states that declared for the Confederacy. Because of those numbers, only one of these units is what I would term a full green flag regiment. So the 10th Tennessee Infantry, who carry a green flag into battle, mainly formed of men based around Nashville in Tennessee. But there was an awful lot of companies. You get them all over the place, these kind of company level formations who often carry green flags into engagements as well. 6 of the generals, 6 of those 18 generals were Irish born, but they also have the most significant from the American Civil War's perspective and the impact on the war. And he's the guy up the top right, who's Major General Patrick Renan Claiborne from County Cork, who is the highest ranking Irishman of the American Civil War. He had immigrated. This is a man who spent more than half his life in Ireland before he emigrates to the United States. He's completely unknown in Ireland, but is incredibly well known for anyone interested in the American Civil War, particularly the Western theater. Emigrates to Arkansas, where all of his life is turned around. His life had been pretty unsuccessful in Ireland. He had served in the ranks in the British Army, having joined up on a whim, having failed the entrance exam to the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. His entire life really is a disaster in Ireland, but everything goes right for him in Arkansas. And when Arkansas secedes, he has absolutely no hesitation in heading off to fight for Arkansas. And he quickly rises through the ranks, commands a brigade at Shiloh, and really develops a wartime reputation as being one of, if not the best, fighting general in the Western theater. Rises to division command, but he saves the Army of Tennessee at Ringgold Gap after the disaster at Chattanooga, but writes a proposal in January of 1864 suggesting that the South should start to enlist enslaved men if they wanted to try and win the war, and then give them their freedom as a result. And he was never promoted after that. It's often asked why he never got the Corps Command. He never gets the Corps Command, and is killed in John Bell Hood's ill-advised assault at Franklin in Tennessee in 1864, leading his men. And he has a statue to him in Ringgold Gap, very well remembered in Franklin, given his prominence in that engagement. Really, really important, fascinating individual. Louisiana, and it's a reflection here that we'll see, but the Confederate units in the South, like those in the North, are concentrated on urban areas. And as a result, because New Orleans is the biggest city in what is the Confederacy, that Louisiana has significant numbers of Irish, by far the largest. And the largest contingent of Irish in the Louisiana service was in the 6th Louisiana Infantry. And if any of you have ever come across this rather striking photograph on the bottom right, this is a really interesting, one of the most interesting Civil War photographs, I think, because this is an image that men who fought at the Battle of Antietam recall seeing. This horse, this white horse in Antietam's cornfield, that's sitting down as if it's asleep and just resting. So men who were fighting in the action refer to this, and it was captured in a photograph shortly afterwards. This is the mount of Colonel Henry Strong, an Irish-born man who commanded the 6th at that battle, and it was shot from under him, and he was killed quite close by to this. A really, really striking image, and one of the only images that we know is actually linked to of a contemporary Civil War image from a battlefield that's linked to Irish and Irish service. Okay. I'm not going to go into too much of the whys and wherefores of people serving because of our time constraints today. But if you want to look at it at the base level, the Irish were the least skilled in terms of artisans, you know, say in comparison to the Germans, of immigrants coming in to the United States in the 1840s and 1850s. And so they generally relied on laboring positions, and they relied on a lot of laboring positions in factory settings, in industrial settings. And so whereas they're largely rural in an Irish context when they immigrate, they become overwhelmingly urban once they go to the United States. And this is a map that shows the cities in 1860, and you can see where the mass of the big cities are, and they're in the north. And that's why you have 180,000 men fighting for the Union and 20,000 fighting for the Confederacy. And if you pick out the cities in the Confederacy, like New Orleans, Montgomery, Charleston, there's big Irish contingents out of places like that. But it is because of that overwhelming concentration in the north that so many of them are making their communities there, making their lives there. And so they serve in huge numbers from there. All right. So I'm going to just go into a couple of little themes before we head in to discussing some of the personal stories, but to get an idea of the significance of the Irish contribution and of the scale. So this is the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the event that starts the American Civil War in April of 1861. Inside the garrison of Fort Sumter, there were more men who had been born in Ireland than had been born in the United States. There were more Irishmen in the regular United States military at the start of the war than there were American born. There's a potential, if you include ethnic Irish Americans, that it's going to be approaching 50% of the regulars before the war are ethnically Irish. Right? These are staggering figures. And at Fort Sumter, as again, many of you are probably aware, nobody is killed before the surrender. But when the flag is being taken down, the Confederates give the garrison the respect of firing a 100-gun salute to the Stars and Stripes. And during that firing, one of the rounds that has been put into the gun misfires and causes the gun to explode. And 6 men are blown up in the air. 5 of those men had been born in Ireland. 1 had been born in the United States. 2 of them subsequently die. Daniel Hawk, a farmer from North County Tipperary, who becomes the first fatality of the American Civil War. And another man, Edward Galway, who's from Skibbereen, an area ravaged by the famine, becomes the second man to die. His brother would later die at Port Hudson in 1863. Again, giving you the type of scale of loss that's being felt. And you have articles being written in Ireland in 1861 that are presaging this event. They talk about how devastating this conflict is going to be for firesides in Ireland as well as those in America, because they know there's going to be huge loss of life. But it goes all the way through to this man. He is, I think, you could argue the most under-regarded Irishman in Union service, because he's generally not known, but he was seen as the best Irish combat leader in the Union military during the Civil War. He's a guy called Tom Smith from Ballyhooly in County Cork. And Smith was seen as a huge loss when he died, but he had fought all through the war. He came out of Delaware. Wilmington was where he lived and went to war with Delaware infantry, rises to brigade command, for example, commands a brigade facing Pickett's charge, briefly commands the Irish brigade, and is in command of a division for long periods of time. And he's to the front during the Appomattox campaign in the dying days of the war, when in and around Farmville, Virginia, he gets struck on the skirmish line and mortally wounded. And he's carried to a nearby house where he dies on the morning that Lee surrenders to Grant and officially becomes the last Union general to be struck down and killed during the American Civil War. So I always use them as a good bookend of just that scale of service. All right, that's Tom Smith. Neither, though, was it just soldiers. And we just often think about the guys who march off to war. But again, this is an image that'll no doubt be very familiar to many of you. It's the rebel sharpshooter in the Devil's Den, one of the famous photographs taken just after the Battle of Gettysburg. But it was exposed by a man called Timothy O'Sullivan, who was Irish-American, almost certainly born in County Cork. And he was one of the most prominent photographers of the American Civil War. He worked for both of the big photography studios during that conflict. And an awful lot of the images that you will see, although they're rarely actually attributed to him, they're normally attributed to Brady or Gardner, who he was working for, were taken by him. All right. A lot of special artists were sent out during the war as well. And one of them was also Irish. This is a sketch by Arthur Lumley. This is of Union troops in Fredericksburg in 1862, when there was famous looting went on. You can see all the Union troops around on rocking chairs and generally having quite a merry time on the streets of Fredericksburg. But Lumley was a Dubliner and one of the most highly regarded war artists during the conflict. So there's an awful lot of these interesting interweaving threads of Irish immigrants in and about involved in the war as well. And it wasn't just men, right? There's some absolutely intriguing stories of women, Irish women's involvement in the war. This is one of my favorites. This is a depiction of Bridget Diver. We don't know where she was from in Ireland, but given her surname, I would hazard a lot of money on Donegal or Derry, certainly the northwest of Ireland. But she was also given the nickname of Custer's Female Wolverine. Custer rises to command of a Michigan cavalry brigade, and Bridget Diver had gone to war with her husband. And there's even some reports of her potentially picking up a musket in action during one of the engagements. A really compelling story. There's other really good ones. There's a story of a woman who's with the Irish Brigade in the Virginia Peninsula, and when some of the men are feeling a bit squeamish under Confederate artillery fire, she's supposed to have gone along and started hitting them in the rump with her umbrella in order to keep them in line. This is another story that's reported during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. Again, not just with the North, though. This is Mary Sophia Hill, another Dubliner. And when Mary was living in New Orleans before the war, or when the war broke out, her brother decided to enlist in the 6th Louisiana, who we were talking about before. And she was convinced that her brother wouldn't be able for it, that he wouldn't be up to the task of being a military man, and it would be broken down by it. And so she decides to accompany the 6th Louisiana as a nurse. And in the years that follows, because of her ministrations, she's often referred to as the Florence Nightingale of the Army of Northern Virginia. And so you get a lot of these women who are nurses as a result. The most famous of those are the nuns, the sisters. So during the Civil War, and if you're interested particularly in the religious aspect, and we'll talk a bit about this in a couple of minutes, but Dr. Will Kurtz has done a lot of interesting work on the religious, the Catholic aspect of the American Civil War. But there were only around 50 priests who went to the war in the Union military, who served as either chaplains or in hospitals. So the slack was taken up largely by sisters. There were over 600 nuns who served, largely the Sisters of the Holy Cross and the Daughters of Charity. This is an image of a famous hospital boat on the Mississippi called the Red Rover, and one of the Daughters of Charity, or excuse me, Sisters of the Holy Cross is shown ministering on the left-hand side. The Holy Cross sisters also lost 2 of their order during the war, Sister Elise O'Brien and Sister Fidelis Lawler, both of whom contracted a disease at the hospital in Mount City and died as a result. And of course, the Ancient Order of Hibernians played a key role in getting the monument to the sisters erected in Washington, D.C. Okay, neither was it just America, and I'll just touch on this very, very briefly. I do a lot of work as well on the links back to Ireland. And one of these on the left here is in Glasnevin Cemetery, where there's an awful lot. You'll all be familiar with Glasnevin Cemetery. It's the area where most of Ireland's, if you like, leading revolutionary heroes are buried. It's also got an awful lot of American Civil War veterans interred in it. And this is the Jesuit plot. The top left photograph is the Jesuit plot. And one of the men interred in there is Father John Bannon, who is called the Confederacy's fighting chaplain. He was the chaplain to the 1st Missouri Confederate Brigade, serves with them through the early part of the war until his capture at the surrender of Vicksburg, when he comes back to Ireland on a mission for the Confederacy. So he went first to the Pope in an effort to try and secure papal recognition of the Confederacy. And then he spends the latter end of the war in Ireland trying to stem the outflow of Irish immigrants who were going to join the Union military. And so he writes an awful lot of letters telling people not to do that. Not with great success, it must be said. But he stays in Ireland for the rest of his life and is buried in Glasnevin. Directly out my window, if I looked left right now, I would be looking at the area where the vessel on the top right, the USS Kearsarge, anchored in 1863. And she took on, when she was here, a whole bunch of illegal recruits. At the time, it was illegal to recruit British citizens, as the Irish were regarded then, into a foreign force. But the Kearsarge took a whole load of guys on. And one of the guys they took on was a guy called Michael Ahern, who had just been laid off in Cove, Queenstown as it was then, unemployed, wanders into a guy from the Kearsarge, joins up, is kept on the vessel. And the following year, the Kearsarge sinks the CSS Alabama, the most famous Confederate raider of the American Civil War. And Michael Ahern is one of the men who receives the Medal of Honor for his actions on it, having never set foot in the United States. Quite an incredible story. And then down the bottom, much altered now, but an older photo from a few years back of the Limerick Clothing Company factory near the train station in Limerick there, which was run by Peter Tate, often said to be the first production line clothing factory in the world. And it supplied uniforms to the Confederate Army. There were men in 1864 and 1865 in the Confederate military who were being clothed in uniforms that were made in Limerick. Okay. Right, so just for the last element then, I want to dive into just a small snippet. Dan was talking about work on letters earlier on, and so my work in the Widow's Pension files, we've had a problem with the Irish and the American Civil War. A lot of the normal, if you like, working class guys who were enlisted, man, a lot of them are illiterate or semi-literate. They lived in rented accommodation. They didn't leave an awful lot of letters behind. It's been a big problem for everybody researching the American Civil War. One area I discovered about a decade ago where they did include letters was in these widows' pension files. When women, wives, mothers, sometimes dependent fathers, were looking to the United States for a pension based on someone who had lost their lives in the Civil War, one of the ways they could prove their entitlement to those pensions was by handing in correspondence that was actually given, sent home to them by their sons. And so it took me quite a few years, but I went through 160,000 of these files, and I created a database of slightly over 1,400 letters written by Irish American servicemen during the Civil War, Union servicemen. And it tells us an awful lot about why they enlisted, what they thought of the war and everything. But the thing I want to concentrate on for this talk is what it tells us about religion, about how they practiced their religion during the war, right? So again, I doubt these need much introduction to you, but on the left is Father William Corby at Gettysburg. This is the statue of him giving the conditional absolution to the Irish Brigade, really famous incident before they go into the wheat field on the 2nd of July. On the right is the Irish Brigade monument at Antietam. And in 1988 at Antietam, archaeological excavations uncovered a number of burials that turned out to be Irish Brigade soldiers. One of these men, actually, his name was narrowed down. But one of the only artifacts they had on them, apart from their New York regimental buttons, was they were carrying rosary beads and a crucifix, right, carrying them into action. And because we didn't have an awful lot about what these ordinary guys are writing, we haven't been able to see how they dealt with the fact that they didn't have a whole lot of Catholic chaplains with them in the military. And so just to touch for a couple of minutes on this aspect of it, I'm going to look at some of those elements of what I've come across in the letter, right? So what do you do if you don't have a Catholic chaplain in your unit? How do you make your peace with your faith when you're going off to war, right? And one of the ways we know they did that is they might get masses said for them. So their family would have masses said for them while they were away, and they would say masses themselves. So here's an example, a guy from County Cavan called Thomas Doyle. So before they go to the front, he and his friend, they're enlisting without telling his mother, which was quite a common activity during the war. But what they went to confession first of all, received the Holy Sacrament, and then I quote, left $5 apiece for masses while we are away, right? So in 1863, we have Thomas Monaghan of the 95th Pennsylvania, who wrote then to thank his mother for the mass you have got said for me. So getting masses said, the same as it is today, for people who were away, was one of the ways they were dealing with it. But the big way that they dealt with this lack of access to the clergy during their service was through things like rosary beads, was through things like scapulars, Agnus Dei. This is what they're carrying with them. And I got overwhelming evidence of this. It's in just all over their letters. I'll give you examples here. A sailor, John Sullivan, writing home in 1863, and he's describing for his mother the measures he takes to strengthen his resolve. And I quote, I have this Agnus Dei next to my heart, mother, and a picture of you and my dear little brothers, with which will give me courage through every battle, right? So you're getting a sense of what it means to him to be carrying these. John Doherty of the Irish Brigade confided that the small articles, and he means scapular here, he wore, and he says, quote, gave me a feeling of safety in the time of danger when the shells was bursting over us and the bullets flying thick around. I felt perfectly safe, right? So this again is what guys who are about to go into action against the stone wall in Fredericksburg are thinking about in those final moments before they attack. So whenever Catholic chaplains did pass through units, they tried to give some scapulars, some sacramentals to the men in the ranks. So John O'Connell in the 2nd Massachusetts, a unit that didn't have a Catholic chaplain, he talks about a priest coming among the Catholics at the regiments, and he gave most of us medals and Agnus Dei, right? So that's the way they're trying to get this word out. A particularly fascinating example I came across is a man who almost certainly was trying to supplement his Agnus Dei with blessed clay that may well have come from Tipperary. So Patrick Dooley, who was in the 40th New York Infantry, the Mozart Regiment, said that he wrote home to thank his mother for sending the blessed clay. They were from Clonmel in County Tipperary. And he said, I'll sew it tonight into my Agnus Dei, right? So really strong sense of what this meant to them, these sacramentals. One of the other big things in relation to religion is the fact that if you were a working class man in the era of the Civil War, Sundays tended to be your only day off, right? So Sundays were also the time when you went to mass. And so it was the time you spent most time with your family. So it was a kind of a routine day that was the one where most of them missed home the most, was a Sunday. So again, you get that referred to in their letters. So Thomas Keating, who was a man in the 9th New York State Militia, was out on guard duty in Maryland on a Sunday early in the war. And he heard bells. And he said, I stood and listened, and it made me cry. It put me in mind of Father Mooney's bells. So Father Mooney was the parish priest back in New York, his home parish. Father Mooney also, by the way, was the first chaplain of the 69th New York State Militia, who got in serious trouble before the First Battle of Bull Run for blessing one of the Union artillery pieces, which was against church doctrine, as you weren't supposed to do that sort of thing with weapons of war. But Father Mooney, back in Manhattan, was who he was thinking of. Thomas Doyle, 4th Maine Infantry, when he got a chance to go to mass, very rare opportunity during the war. And he wrote to his wife, I was glad to think that both you and me heard the word of God together on the same Sunday, although far apart. All right. Where it became a real problem if you were an Irish Catholic in the American Civil War is if you were mortally wounded or killed. It became a big problem for your family. It was a big problem if you were mortally wounded, because in all likelihood, you would not have the comfort of a Catholic priest at your death. And it must be said that other chaplains and people in the hospital staff often went to extraordinary lengths to try and procure a priest. Say a man was dying down in a southern hospital, they would attempt to find them. But you come across these references again and again and again. So a Dubliner, Patrick Connolly, dies in South Carolina. His Connecticut chaplain is Episcopal. And he wrote back to the family of the soldier, and he said that it was a great pity that he could not have been buried by his own priest, but there is none in all this department. It is very wrong, I think, because I know it would be a great comfort to the boys to have some father confessor where they could have his services. Again, this is a 6th Connecticut Infantry. This is a man showing you how many Irish are serving in these non-ethnic units. He's talking about these Catholic Irish lads not having a priest. Thomas Hines was a sailor who died of disease during the war while he was in Acapulco in Mexico, not an area we generally think of in the Civil War. And his wife wanted to know that he had the last rites. But she got the response to say that no, he had not the rights of the church, but he had his senses to the last, and Jesus, the great high priest, to hear. Kieran Phelan went to war with the 11th Connecticut Infantry. And when he died late in the war, his wife asked the same question. And an Irish soldier, it was nearly always Irish soldiers who wrote back for these men. He said, about the priest, he did not have one, for I can assure you that they are not very plenty in the army. I don't know that there is one in the entire 18th Corps. And as for being prepared for death, I cannot say. I hope that he was. Pretty cold comfort. Okay, we're running low enough on time, so I'll probably only get to a couple of these, but just to get to some of the other elements of these stories. And just, I was talking about 19th century Irish life and what these files can tell you about these often invisible, these stories of people who just don't leave a record normally. We might get a couple of names on a census return, might be about it, right? Private Hugh Coyle was from the Fanad Peninsula in Donegal, actually a part of the country where one side of my family comes from, so I have very strong interest in it. Really rural part of Ireland today even, never mind in the 19th century. Hugh emigrated to Pennsylvania like an awful lot of Donegal people did, huge ties to Pennsylvania, and was in the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and is captured just after Gettysburg, during the pursuit after Gettysburg. And he dies at Andersonville. Andersonville contains more Civil War Irish interments than any other national cemetery in the United States. And his parents were still in Donegal. And they were writing looking to get money based on Hugh's service. And when you're looking for these sort of, when you're looking for money in these sort of circumstances, you know, you might often expect people to kind of play up the hardships to try and really close the deal in terms of getting the payments that they're entitled to, particularly the Irish, who would be suffering from problems with nativism. And when Eunice Coyle approaches her solicitor in Ireland to try and get the American government to pay the pension, what she says is that herself and her husband were about to be put out of their farm by the landlord because he wanted to graze black cattle. And I thought, oh no, she's over-egging the pudding here. This is a bit too much. But she includes, and this is in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the notice to quit from the 3rd Earl of Leitrim's agent. The 3rd Earl of Leitrim being one of the most infamous Irish landlords of the 19th century, who not a few years after this would be bludgeoned to death by some of his tenants who tried to shoot him with a blunderbuss that misfired, and then they beat him to death with it. He was a very hated man. But they actually include an incredibly rare document, an original 19th century notice to quit for eviction, because they did want to graze the black cattle. Okay. This is one of, I think, the most compelling stories I've ever come across, and it relates to Thomas Madigan of the 69th New York State Militia. Irish people who emigrated during the famine did not talk about it. So when you look at the files and people are looking, they're talking about, you'll often hear the father died in County Cork in 1847, or the mother died in Cavan in 1848, all during the famine. It'll never, ever say that it was the famine that killed them. The only time I've only ever found 2 references in looking at thousands of files, but the main one is this, the Madigan family, who are from Ratu in North County Kerry, an area devastated by the famine. Thomas Madigan of the 69th New York State Militia, his father dies of dropsy, which is a famine-caused disease in Black 47. And they emigrate. And this is where most, in an Irish sense, in Ireland, they're kind of left at the port and it's terrible, everybody's gone. The Madigan story just gets worse after they leave. Thomas Madigan's mother remarries to another Irish man who's abusive and violent towards her. But eventually she is rescued from that situation, rescues herself really. She flees to Thomas, her eldest son, who was working as a tinsmith in New York. Not long afterwards, Thomas marches off in the 69th New York State Militia. There'd be no surprises to think that he would be enlisted in the 69th New York State Militia, given the family history in Ireland. And he heads out to the first battle of the war, where he is mortally wounded on the slopes of Henry Hill. What's really interesting about this for me is Mary Madigan, his mother, had gone through untold hardships, but she had to write back to Kerry to try and get her marriage certificate to get a pension. And when she does so, her sister, who was working in a domestic situation in Tralee, County Kerry, writes back to her. And she talks about how when you left, you said you were going to send me money. She says, it's terrible about Thomas. I'm very sorry to hear about it. We'll get masses said for him. Her own son has gone off. She said she was sorry to give him the money to emigrate, only for it to be the means of him enlisting in the army. And then she spends the second half of the letter talking about how Mary had let her down because she was not sending enough money back to Ireland for her, that she had made, as I thought, faithful promises, but poor performances, right? And I think this is a really important aspect of these guys' service and Irish America in this period generally. No matter what hardships they endure in the United States, they are seen as the fortunate ones in Ireland by their families. They have a consistent responsibility to remit money to them, that if they don't do it, they're looked badly upon, and try and get more people over to the United States. So they always fondly look back and they do see themselves as exiles, but there is this almost a contract with the people back in their home locations, that they are the lucky ones who got away. And I'm going to just wrap it up with some of these things are highly emotive. And everybody I've spoken about, all the guys I've quoted all the way through this, all of that survives because none of them survived the American Civil War. So every one of them died as a result of the war. And I'm just going to end with this one. John Heron served in Corcoran's Irish Legion. He was in the 170th New York Infantry. His mother was Anna Heron. They could be Heron. They're probably more likely to be a Hearn, and this is a phonetic spelling based on it, right? These people are semi-literate and illiterate. This woman didn't write her own letters. He was 21, John, when he enlists on the 10th of September 1862. And during the Overland Campaign, Corcoran's Legion got pretty badly cut up at the North Anna River, a battle that didn't have an awful lot of people cut up in it, but the Legion were one of them. They were fighting men of the 43rd North Carolina at the time. He wasn't killed there, but he was wounded and he suffered a gunshot wound. So Anna had found out that he was wounded, but then she finds out no more from him. And she writes this letter on the left. It's stated, and I'll read it. New York, June 27th, 1864. My dear son, I write you these few lines hoping to find you in good health, as this leaves me in trouble about you. Dear son, I wrote to you twice and I received no answer yet. And if you were alive, I hope you will write to me. Dear son, ain't you got anyone to write for you? Dear son, I expected you in New York. The rest of your regiment came to New York that was wounded. For God's sake, dear son, write to me. No more at present from your affectionate mother, Mrs. A. Herron. Direct your letter to 662 Water Street, New York. Okay? So that sickening anxiety that she's feeling about her son. And if we just move, and often officers and people in hospitals were very good at giving letters to family when something had happened to them. Sometimes they weren't. This is the reverse of that letter. And if you look at the top of it there, this is what she got back. It's the same letter with a note written on the top of it saying, Washington Hall Branch, 2nd Division, General Hospital, Alexandria, Virginia, June 29, 64. John E. Herron, almost certainly a Hearn, died at this hospital June 8, 1864 with gunshot wound in left knee and was buried in this city in good order. And that's it, just signed. This is handed back to her, brought to her tenement. She's illiterate, read out to her. And that's how she finds out that her son had given his life for the United States. Okay, I will draw to a close there, but just to say, just ending it with the pictures of these men, and I always say this in Ireland, we think it's a long time ago. The man in the top left is Jeremiah O'Brien, who claimed at least, and probably did serve in Confederate Virginia Cavalry during the war. The last man I can identify who'd served in the American Civil War to die, he died in 1950. That is how recent it was. The man on the right, Seamus Condon, who's a veteran himself of the Irish Army in the Congo, is holding the memoirs of his own grandfather, Andrew Byrne, who was a Fenian. He has a mugshot taken in Mountjoy of him, but served in the 65th New York Infantry and wrote up his memoirs. And down in the bottom left, the Humphrey Lynch's family. Humphrey Lynch, who served in the regular army throughout the Western Theatre, came back with the money he'd made in America and set up a bar in Mayfield in Cork that's still there called the Cotton Ball. And that's his grandson on the lower left. So all these grandchildren of these men still alive. But I'll draw to a close there. I've gone on a bit too long, but there we go. Thanks very much.
Wow, that was incredible, Damien. Quite an education for me, I could tell you that. We're going to run through our panel with some beginning of questions and then bring in some of our guests. We'll go from Dan Taylor to Neil Cosgrove to Judge McKay, and then any other panel members and guests at that point. Dan?
Thank you, Danny. Damien, when you talk about raising awareness in Ireland, one has to think of an event that probably should have raised some awareness, and that would be President John F. Kennedy's remarks as first sitting U.S. president to address the Dáil back in 1963. And as you know, the centerpiece of that presentation was presenting one of those green flags that you've spoken of today. Can you tell us about the impact that visit of President Kennedy, the presentation of the colors of the Irish Brigade had in Ireland, and where that flag is today? Yeah.
And I mean, that was a major, an incredible object for him to bring with him, actually, given its significance. So it is one of the replacement colors for the Irish Brigade. Just to give a bit of its backstory, the Tiffany Company actually were making the Irish Brigade green flags, the famous flags. And everybody really knows about the story of Fredericksburg. But at Fredericksburg, because it hadn't been expected that there would be a winter campaign, the early flags of the regiment had been sent back, the green flag, because they were tattered, they were destroyed. And so the only regiment to carry a green flag into battle that day was the 28th Massachusetts, which is the reason that Marr tells all the other men to put boxwood in their caps so that they would know they were Irish. And the flag that President Kennedy brought is one of the replacement flags that was being made for the occasion after those other flags had been sent back. And it's a very compelling, and it still gets shown quite a lot, actually, President Kennedy's speech in the Dáil here, where he's handing over the flag. And it's still on display in Dáil Éireann. So if you ever take a tour of the Oireachtas, it's one of the things that's shown there. And it had a big impact at the time. I actually was advocating for a short period during the 150th if the flag could come out of the Dáil into kind of more public area in the museum, because I think more people actually interact with an object like that, the more they start to think about the sheer scale of involvement. But it certainly had a major impact, I think, at the time. As we all know, President Kennedy's visit in any event is still spoken about, and has had an amazing impact. But I don't think it's actually ever been carried forward. It's an interesting dynamic to me. If you go to the United Kingdom, for example, the Civil War roundtables that you have in the United States, great centers of discussion of the American Civil War. There's a very vibrant one in London in the United Kingdom. We've never had one in Ireland. And it's an interesting dynamic in that regard. And I think one of the reasons that it's not remembered as much here, and it's not something I showed in that presentation, the Irish have one of the lowest return rates of immigrants in Europe. They do not come back once they leave. They just don't. Even if they have the opportunity to do so, they don't come back. And if you look at the American Civil War veterans, there's really very, very few. There was 219 people claiming American pensions in Ireland in 1883, out of a group of hundreds of thousands of people who would have been eligible for them because of service. There's only 219 being claimed in Ireland because they're not coming back in large numbers. And so I think that kind of shearing of the direct link is something that is one of the reasons that we haven't had the level of memory. The big First World War remembrance of the last few years has been driven by people realizing that their grandfather, their great-grandfather served in those units. And that's a direct genealogical collection that's been severed in most cases in Ireland. I've been trying to bring it back, but I'm kind of laboring the point here, but bring it back by trying to get people to relate to the American Civil War people who were from their own localities. Because we all know that if you can think about someone, it was from around New Ross, say, like the Kennedy family, that if you can do that, people really can make a tangible link in their own minds to it, and it makes it much more powerful.
And Damien, before I pass you down the panel, we're celebrating and observing Irish Heritage Month. This series is part of that. What can you tell us about the observation of St. Patrick's Day by the Irish serving in the American Civil War?
Oh yeah, well that's a favorite topic of mine. Really, really interesting, the St. Patrick's Day celebrations. So one of the important things we always have to remember about the Irish Brigade in particular, but all Irish ethnic units. So they celebrated their Irishness. One of the things they knew they were doing, though, is they knew they were representing the Irish. So they had an additional weight. Anytime they walked onto a battlefield, anytime they were doing anything, they knew that they were having, if you like, a disproportionate impact on people's impression of the Irish in the United States. Okay, that's a very important context in relation to the position of the Irish, which again, I'm sure you're all familiar with in the 1840s, the 50s, the know-nothingism, anti-Catholicism, an awful lot of anti-immigrant sentiment there against the Irish. And so the Irish Brigade, particularly, are very conscious of doing well on the battlefield and of putting their best foot forward. And Patrick's Day is probably the most important element of that. And there was no more, and I mean, if you're talking about Patrick's Day in the war, there's 1863 is the be all and end all. It's celebrated every year, but the Irish Brigade in 1863 put on, and I call it a public relations blitz. It is a mass event in the Army of the Potomac. It's one of the most frequently mentioned aspects of the history of the Army of the Potomac is this Irish Brigade celebration that they put on. And you can imagine the fun and frolics that was had the minute the Irish are having a party, as we all know. They were building race courses. They were running around after soaked pigs. They were doing sack races over 500 yards. They were swapping. Officers became privates. Privates become officers for the day. They invite all the leading men of all the leading generals of the army to the event, and just have this huge celebration. And it's always there. It should be said they always started off every year with all of those things with religious ceremonies, usually in the morning of St. Patrick's Day. But it's a really, really important time for them to kind of have downtime, but also to celebrate their Irishness. And you do see the difference with some other men, Irish men who aren't serving in ethnic Irish units. So I have a letter, from a guy, he's serving over with Sherman's army in 1865, and he was saying in March, he says, "Oh, we have no chance to drown the old toad here today." In other words, to drink. But they don't get the same opportunity if you're not serving in those ethnic units where it's not an important aspect of your unit identity to celebrate it in the same way. But it was very important, really, really, certainly the most important event, I think, in the Irish Brigade's public history was the 1863 St. Patrick's Day celebrations.
Thank you. And I think I'll pass you on now to our Irish Heritage Chair, Neil Cosgrove.
Well, Damien, first off, you did not disappoint. A fantastic talk. Your best ever. One thing I'm kind of curious about, because you talk about Ireland, but I kind of noticed too during the 175th anniversary of the Civil War over here that the Irish, to my mind, and of course I'm biased, did not get the play that they should. And I'm kind of curious, as a historian, what you think of that. And also too, as far as, we know the numbers, but I think also the effectiveness of the Irish units. It seemed to me when I was reading that, like in McClellan's Peninsula campaign, the 69th seemed to be the rear guard of every retreat. They seemed to be the last off the field. And the Confederates, certainly, I think it was Alexander, General Edward Porter Alexander basically said, of the Union Army, their cavalry is numerous, but they can't ride, and their infantry, except the Irish, can't fight. But it doesn't seem that appreciation, of basically kind of being the rear guard in 61 and 1862 of the Irish, but the way they held the line, it doesn't seem to be as appreciated as perhaps it should be.
It's an interesting point. What I would say is that they definitely got their due at Fredericksburg. They were front and center in the 150th events there. And I think it's a kind of a complicated answer to this, right? So I think generally, because I've been looking at it, pound for pound, I don't think there's a difference between the Irish soldier, say, and an American-born soldier in the Civil War in terms of their performance. I think when you look at it in the round, but again, you have things like the Irish Brigade. Maybe not the most popular opinion, but Thomas Francis Meagher is a fantastic motivator of men. He's not the best general, right? So the Irish Brigade are very prominent early in the war, carrying the green flags and everything. And a lot of it is Meagher's tactics as well. Meagher is looking for them. Meagher is looking for them to do, we give them the bayonet and we charge in a certain way and everything like that. There's a lot of interesting things around the peninsula in 1862. I think a lot of the fighting before Antietam generally tends not to get much appreciation at all from anyone. I often think that the Peninsula campaign actually had a really detrimental impact on Thomas Francis Meagher. I think it really, really affected him, the losses that the Irish Brigade took there. But I suppose I spent a lot of the 150th trying to focus on getting Ireland to recognize an awful lot of what was going on. And that wasn't being hugely successful. Mm-hmm. But I think when you're looking at the Irish Brigade and everything, it does come down that an awful lot of the focus in terms of the Irish, I think, is always on the brigade. Mm-hmm. In terms of the 150th, when you're looking at things, it's Antietam. And if you're not looking at the kind of global Irish contribution, you're not making as much of an inference of the Irish contribution to other fields, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it does.
I wrote a piece, and I think it's an important one, because let's think about Gettysburg, right? So if we're thinking about the Irish Brigade, and I would agree with you, we always think about the Irish Brigade in relation to Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg. We don't think about them anywhere else. And they did a lot of heavy service in the peninsula. But at Gettysburg, which if you ever talk about the Irish at Gettysburg, you always talk about the Irish Brigade in the wheat field. There was regulars came down off Little Round Top through that wheat field and fought through it, who lost a greater real and proportionate loss of Irishmen in the wheat field than the Irish Brigade did.
Right.
Actually, if you're talking about the Irish in the wheat field, we should really be talking about the US regulars, because the men they lose. But we never talk about that. So I often think they're trapped sometimes by, I mean, and I love the brigade. Might be my dream to write another history of the Irish Brigade.
Yeah.
But we sometimes become trapped by that because they're everywhere in service and contributing hugely all over the place.
Yeah.
And I think in that respect, they don't get their due because because it's always just kind of very narrow ethnic.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think I'll pass you over to the judge. I'm sure he'll ask something about Wheats Tigers.
Before we go to the judge, Damien, as you know, we began the month with Irish American, the 1916 Rising. And then we followed up with the drill down to Michael McGovern, the Puddler poet. And what a nice tie-in. This week we moved into Irish in the American Civil War. And next week, we're going to bring in Neil O'Dowd with Lincoln and the Irish, kind of drilling down, following the same segment. So I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that next week's event, the links will be out Monday, will be Neil O'Dowd with a great follow-up to what we learned here today from Damien, but getting more specific to Lincoln and the Irish. With that, we'll move next to our other IT expert, Judge James McKay.
Thank you, Danny. Damien, thank you so much. That was fabulous. I could go on for hours and hours and maybe nitpick a few points with you. Obviously, I'm raised from the southern side. I suggest that your numbers may be a little low on the numbers of the Irish born in the South. I would imagine if your records are coming from pensions, then it's obvious that there are more pension information coming from the North, since there weren't many pensions giving out.
No, very few.
Confederate soldiers. So I think it was fabulous. I've heard anybody 40 years ago who was a history major in any school in the South was an authority on Civil War, and it's not as popular now, maybe even non-politic as the with the statute. If you would have come to New Orleans 20 years ago, you would have known that not only was it a staunch Confederate city, but a very Irish Confederate city. And I remember many historians saying that the Civil War was the last great Celtic war. And if not only Irish born, but of all the descendants, Irish Americans, Scotch Irish Americans, certainly in all the Carolinas, Stonewall Jackson, certainly one of the ones that stand out as one of the Ulster Irish. But I think that there are many. We have great documentation in New Orleans. I'd like to try and send it to you. I thought I would be on the air with some of my with my Louisiana Irish Civil War experts, but this is a Saturday and rounding them up. The weather's beautiful outside, so it's I'd have to drag them in front of a computer. But I'd like to send you some information we have on some of the Irish priests, the chaplains who served, and the famous Irish Confederate poet priest who was very famous here in New Orleans. But I could go on and on and on, and I would love to hear more of it, this type of thing, especially as specifics that we can maybe find and help you with any information. We have quite a few archives down here in New Orleans and some universities who do just that. And I'll get my people in contact with you. But thank you so much. This has been fabulous.
Thank you, Judge. I really appreciate that.
What a great Irish Heritage Month segment. Thank you so much. And thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Judge. Damien, we're going to follow up. I'm going to follow up with you next week. I want to ask a follow-up question that'll take a little more time. I don't want to address it here today, but I was very intrigued with the 146 Irish-born Medal of Honor recipient. I know Wikipedia claims there's 257 Irish-born Americans that have received the Medal of Honor. And so that's so important to us as we work in our different immigration issues moving forward. But what's more important than that today is we have 3 guests on our Zoom that have questions, and we're going to go from John Callahan to Ed Halligan, Ed is the dean of our directors for the National Board, and then James Gilmore. And then we're going to hear a couple questions from YouTube, and we're going to wrap up with Marilyn Madigan. Once you talked about Madigan, I could hear her chirping up in Cleveland, Ohio. And before we get to her, I just want you to know that they tried to close her church, and she ended up getting the Pope to write a letter to the bishop, and the church is still open. And in the letter, it was in Latin, and the only thing she knew for sure was where it said Marilyn Madigan. So that bishop is still upset with us. So don't mess with Maryland. But we're going to go John Callahan.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to comment. I knew nothing about the First Missouri until this discussion. And Dr. Shields, thank you for the depth and breadth of your research. You have now sent me off on a long road of Irish history and the Civil War. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, John. There's a good book actually called The Confederacy's Fighting Chaplain on Bannon that you can pick up if you're interested in learning a bit more about him.
Thank you. Yes, I understand Father Bannon at one time spent quite a bit of his youth in the St. Louis, Missouri, but I had no idea that he was such an important figure to the Confederacy. Again, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, John.
As a son of an immigrant, I should know this stuff, but I don't.
Oh, we're always all learning. There's always too much to read. I'm forever reading.
Thank you.
Dean Halligan.
Thank you, Dan. Dr. Shields, that was amazing today. You were talking about the Medal of Honor. The AOH has an obelisk at the Medal of Honor Grove, which honors, and all 50 states are represented, but there were the Irish born that had no state because they came from Ireland.
Yeah.
So the AOH put up an obelisk with not just the Irish, but those that didn't have a state that they were in. And we've done a lot of work on that over the years, and I'm lucky it's only about a half hour from where I am. But you talked about the round table also, that the Civil War, the United Kingdom has that. It's funny because several years ago, we had a client from London, and normally he would come over and play golf. And he says, look, we're not really good at golf. Can we go to Gettysburg? I had been there when I was a kid. Now we go out there. And of course, we wanted to see the 69th. And when you look across that field to see where Pickett's charge came from, it just does something to you to say, my God, they just got mowed down. It was unbelievable. But that they held the angle there is another just incredible. So anybody ever gets a chance to go to Gettysburg and get one of the guides to tell you the story about it, it's amazing. But thank you so much. It was really interesting. It was great.
I'll tell you just a quick one about the 69 Pennsylvania, if I can. And it always struck me, because I work on the pensions files, and there's one young lad who was writing home to his mother, and he was so young that he was asking her to send out, I think it was called the balm of 1,000 flowers to get the pimples off my face. He was worried about the acne and all the impact it was having on him. And he was concerned at one point in the war that his mother was lonesome back in Philadelphia. Again, we don't have a county for him, but almost certainly he was also Diver, almost certainly Donegal Derry. And he was really worried that she was lonely at home. And he went so far as to buy a big kind of greatcoat and stuff, a civilian greatcoat, because he was going to take French leave, as he called it, to go during a quiet time in camp to go and visit her. But then he thought bad against it. And we've all these letters that he left, and he died defending Stonewall against. And I've been there. I always think of him, you know. And I mean, there's those stories are there for a lot of those boys in the 69 Pennsylvania there. And
wow.
Rorty and people behind him. But yeah. Some spot.
Yeah.
When you get back there, Damien, now Ed's a half hour away. He'll take you out to dinner. And,
I'd love to see that, the Medal of Honor.
Show
Medal
you
of Honor
because he's that close. We'd hate to miss an opportunity for the AOH to host you. So when
Absolutely.
you do get back, make sure Dean Halligan knows.
I will, certainly. Thanks. Yeah.
James Gilmore, if you'll unmute. There you go. All yours.
Yes, how you doing? Damien, great drill down into some of the more personal aspects of the Civil War and the participants there. We always hear of the highlights, and those are very good details and such. I really appreciated that. One of the things that you implied was that most of the Irish were representing their residencies almost, and maybe maybe or maybe not necessarily a cause of either, freedom for the oppressed or otherwise. Do you think that's true, or is it a little bit of both?
No, absolutely not. So yeah, I mean, it's a lecture in itself, so I was keen not to dive too far. In terms of the guys fighting for the North, there are two very clear reasons that they enlist in the Union military. So one of them is economic, right? That and they're not, it has to be said, these are not mutually exclusive. People have tended to you'll often read in books that the Irish were mercenary, which is a term I hate in relation to the American Civil War. I really do not like the use of the term. These guys are at the bottom level of society. When the South Carolina secedes, and again, this doesn't get an awful lot of airplay. When South Carolina secedes, it drives the North into an instantaneous and massive recession that impacts places like New York, places like Massachusetts, places like Philadelphia, and the factories that are in those places. And the people who work in those factories and the people who are laid off are Irish in huge numbers. So there is a recession in the midst of a very community living on the margins when the war starts. So there are guys who are at first bull run in units who part of their reason for enlisting is because they need money. But we can't allow that it is not mutually exclusive. And again, it's having a discussion about this quite recently. Like the idea that because you have an economic incentive that you don't then have any sort of other reason for joining is not true, that you would have one individual reason. The other one that is overwhelming in their correspondence is their desire to defend the United States of America and to preserve the Republic that they saw as unique in the world, preserve that democracy that they felt was under threat. Now, it has to be said, they did not go to war over slavery. Like that in the North, that wasn't their primary goal. They weren't particularly interested in the plight of African Americans, it must be said, but they were very interested in the plight of the United States. And it's something that I think has maybe been downplayed too much, the degree of fervor that a lot of them had for it. So you have guys who I've letters written about it. Guys writing a letter from Castle Garden, which is the immigration depot, Castle Clinton on the south point of Manhattan. And they're going, this is the greatest country in the world, the minute they step off the boat. There are people writing back to their mothers in West Cork. I have a great letter from a Union sailor written off the boat, and he sent back to West Cork from the boat. And he's telling his mother, you should get out here. And the old landlord there would have a hard hunt after any of my wages now, because they don't have any time for the likes of him over here, and he'd get a boot. Like this kind of hierarchy of people. And like this is really fervently held by an awful lot of these guys. So for some of them, they align really well. Their position, their jobs, they're very precarious employment, but they also want to preserve the United States. And that is why they enlist. Because again, we have to now think when we're talking about the numbers that they serve, like nativism was a terrible problem in the Union military. Like you could get martinet officers who did not like Irish Catholics. So the Irish are known to have suffered more punishments than other people disproportionately than, say, native-born men and everything. So why are they enlisting at or above their percentage of population? It's the two things combined, and they far outstrip any other reasons for those two melding. So, yeah, in a nutshell.
Thank you, James. We're going to go to Tim Noonan and hear from our folks that are joining us on YouTube. Thank you. I think we have well over 50 people on YouTube at the moment. Then we're going to follow up with Marilyn Madigan, and then we'll go to our remaining panelists for the close. But it's all yours, Tim.
All right. Thanks, Danny. Damien, there's a couple of questions we have on YouTube. First question is, at any time did the Irish troops go against each other in war?
Yes, they did. Right. So the one time that gets the most attention, probably it gets too much attention, is Fredericksburg. So if anybody's seen the film Gods and Generals, there's a lot wrong with the film, but there's a scene in it where the Irish Brigade are attacking the stone wall, and there were Irish Confederates on the other side of that stone wall. There's a depiction there actually where the Irish Confederate on one side of the stone wall is crying, shooting at the Irish Brigade. It has to be said that did not happen. They never really had an issue with shooting each other when it came to it. But there are a number of examples. I wrote up one myself at the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky, where the Irishmen of the 5th Confederate Infantry, which was a Tennessee infantry unit, come up against the 10th Ohio, I think it is, in and around there. So it's not unusual. At Pickett's Charge, the 1st Virginia, which had an awful lot of Richmond Irish in it. John Mitchell's son, for any of you who know John Mitchell, his son Willie Mitchell is killed in that assault, and they're going up against plenty of Irishmen behind the stone wall in the likes of the units of the 69 Pennsylvania. So it's quite frequent. The Louisiana troops, particularly, you see over towards Cemetery Hill and everything, are fighting against a lot of Irish troops. So frequently, but there's no evidence that they have a particular problem with fighting each other, if you know what I mean. So that this kind of idea that there was any qualms, that they were both very, in large degree, fairly convinced of their respective causes. So, you know, they thought the others were wrong in much as all the rest of them did.
Just real quick, the percentage of Irish Catholics on both sides, do we have a number on that?
No, we don't.
Okay.
One thing I would just say is that often left out of the story because there's a big focus on people like Grant and everything, but there were an awful lot of 1st generation and 2nd generation Irish Protestants and Presbyterians fighting in the war as well. Overwhelmingly Catholic, of course, but they often served together. In fact, there were Protestants in the Irish Brigade, for example.
And lastly, can you talk about the draft riots in New York City in July 1863?
Yeah. So as I was pointing out, and again, this is be a much longer lecture, but I'll try and make it succinct. The Irish generally didn't go to war in relation with any kind of conviction of trying to end slavery. In fact, they had a reputation for being pretty racist in relation to African Americans during the war. And so the draft riots break out in 1863. The majority of rioters are Irish because it's on Manhattan as well. And most of the people who are attacked are African American, because there's a degree of blame is being placed by the community, which has lost a huge number of people, it has to be said, during the war. They see it as a rich man's war, a poor man's fight. Now a draft has been instituted that is again going to disproportionately affect them because they can't pay to get out of it, like the richer people in society can do. But a lot of them turn their ire on African Americans, who they see as being the cause of the war. The Irish didn't have much truck with a lot of abolitionists, for example, were very anti-Catholic in this period. It's not often remembered, but that was the case. They didn't like radical Republicans, who they saw as threatening the Constitution and the integrity of the United States. And so they kind of bubbles up and explodes into the draft riots. Again, though, always worth tempering these things. The great bulk of Irish on Manhattan had no involvement in the draft riots whatsoever. So again, I think we can tend to overplay it in terms of the Irish wholesale turning against the war in 1863. Their enlistments don't suggest that was the case. But again, that's a big question, but a very short answer.
Thank you, and everybody was really enjoying your presentation today. So there's a lot of congratulations and how wonderful it is. So.
You mentioned the movie getting it wrong, and that happens so often where movies are based on, they get away with it by saying it's a docudrama, so it has some real things and some fake things. But one of the things we've always talked about was what a great job Liam Neeson did and Michael Collins in bringing the life of the rebellion to light. But one of the things they chose to do in the movie, which was great for the film itself, was surrender in front of the GPO, as opposed to Moore Street, where it actually the battle ended. And tomorrow at 2:00, we will be having a presentation on Moore Street, the birthplace of the Republic, as opposed to complete heritage and talking about what happened during the surrender. They're talking about what the families of the signatories and the folks that were in the GPO, one of the options that they'd like to see done with the battlefield. And we've talked today about Gettysburg, which anyone who's been there, I need to say no more. If you haven't been there, go there. And you look at that, commemorating the many battles that took place in Gettysburg. Then you go to Moore Street. And Judge McKay and I spent a lot of time with the people there. And the Moore Street's just a dirty old back alley with a little plaque on the second story so nobody could take it off. And so we're going to hear that tomorrow at 2 o'clock if anyone wants to join that. And now we're going to go to that troublemaker, Damien, so don't mess with her. Marilyn Madigan, our National Vice President for the Ladies Ancient Order Hibernians.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Damien, for recognizing the work of the sisters. They are our unsung heroines. They were willing to minister to both the Yankees as well as the Confederate States. And 98% of those women were either Irish born or of Irish descent. And I'm very proud that our president, Ellen Ryan Jolly, who was a dramatic force behind the Nuns of the Battlefield, she fought to have that monument done. And in doing so, she had to do a lot of research on those women. And she wrote a book, The Nuns of the Battlefield. And I'm proud to say that it was dedicated in 1924. And I'm the chairman of the Nuns of the Battlefield Centennial Committee, because in 2024, we're going to have a wayside marker dedicated to the story of those 12 orders of nuns and to Ellen Ryan Jolly and the Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians of who did that monument. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront of this talk today.
Thanks, Marilyn. The book is behind me on the shelf. Yeah, and it's a story that deserves to be told. And I should say, like, I've come across a few letters even in the pension files, that the nuns are writing for these guys. The service that they provided to both sides, as you say, was quite remarkable. And it, more than any other, I think, you get a lot of people across the religious divide, really, their service, like people who weren't Catholics and everything often spoke about them. A really remarkable story.
Well, it's interesting when you look at Ellen Ryan Jolly's book. She is more of unbiased about the nuns, but a Sister of Charity just found some of the nuns' own stories, and they don't really talk about their service as nurses as much as ministering to the men as they're dying, and how they would put the medals underneath their pillows or baptize them. They were talking more about how they baptized, brought people into the Catholic faith, and what they did to go against. A lot of those soldiers went back, and their views of Catholics was changed because of the nuns at the battlefield.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for mentioning them.
No, thanks, Marilyn.
Ed Maloney, I believe you had a question. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
No, I think the only question, you probably answered it, but the only question I had was, you mentioned the motive of the Northern soldiers, which was well understood, but the Confederates didn't have that sense of the Union.
No, they certainly didn't. But if you look, so there's a difference. And I've done a lot of work on things like, looking at, say, the investment that they would have had. Some of them, I've done analysis of the officers in relation to slaveholding and things like this. A lot of them in the Confederacy seem to have had a real loyalty to state, like Claiborne would have had to Arkansas. But they were very invested in Southern society. A lot of them would have argued as well that, not without merit, it must be said, that they had a better time of it in the South than they had in the North, where they weren't being exploited as much, because obviously the labor that a lot of the Irish were taking part in the North wasn't being performed necessarily to the same degrees in the South, although you would have a lot of people working on the levees and everything like this. But yeah, so there's a lot of similarities in terms of if you're looking at community and state level, but they are invested in the cause of the Confederacy to quite a degree. They actually may well have served, even at the proportion, whatever you would suggest it is, they at an incredibly high rate of males of military age who are Irish in the South enlist. Like, so they, at least initially, and I would highly recommend Professor David Gleason's book on this. He's written a phenomenally good book on the Irish, the Green and the Grey, it's called, the Irish and the Confederate States. But you see this huge influx at the very start. So they're very invested. They're carried along on both sides at the start of the war, like everyone else is. There's a fervor at the start of the war that carries huge numbers of people into the military in 1861 in particular. Like, again, just to go to the North, like 50% of the letters I come across are guys who enlist in 1861, so they're just a huge rush. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And remember, we could all learn more by purchasing Damien's book. And the link was in everything we sent out. We will have the links to all of the books tied into our events as we move into next month, and we certainly encourage everyone to do so. We're going to run through our national chairs for any, our national executives for any comments or questions, beginning with Sean, and we're going to end with Liam and maybe get a promotion for Monday night's event in Albany. So they weren't as kind as us, Damien. We planned this on a Saturday, so you didn't have to be on at midnight your time. Of course, you look a lot younger than me, so it's probably easier for you to stay up till midnight. Marilyn and I will be sacked out by 10. Sean Pender?
Thank you, Dan. Great job putting this together. And Damien, that was, I could have stayed on for a lot longer. Great presentation. You know, we all know the Civil War was so pivotal, and I'm doing a lot of listening now, not reading, but listening while I walk. I'm in that period, and it's amazing that, you know, there for a couple of decisions on different battlefields, who know what could have happened. And it was a brutal war. I mean, some of the stuff that you've talked to here just made you think of the personal loss, that poor mother writing letters one upon the other, and you know, there, but for the grace of God, could have been so many. So I think the fact that you're memorializing some of those that were forgotten. I mean, the numbers of loss during that time are so great that at some point, some of these people, that might be the only memory that they have. So it's amazing. And a little black humor there, the letter from the person from Ireland saying, when you're not doing enough. I think I might have an aunt like that, so I'd like you to send me that information. But thank you very much for a great presentation, and I'm definitely looking forward to looking up your book. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sean.
Appreciate it.
It was so good to hear you talk about Glasnevin. Judge McKay and I spent a day with the curator at Glasnevin and his staff, and it was really kind of neat. I actually got to hold a book with the Daniel O'Connell signature of the meetings, closing the meeting minutes when he was president of the cemetery. But one of the best stories they talked about was there was a Confederate Civil War reenactment team from the United States came to Glasnevin, and they let them know they were coming. And he said they didn't expect what they got. They didn't understand what Civil War reenactors did. And they came in dressed in, you know, the gray uniforms, and they marched in, and they had weapons, and there was a funeral going on, and all of a sudden they were doing a 21 gun salute, and they hadn't how they arranged all this and got it done, but it was a surprise to the folks at Glasnevin Cemetery. Jerry Cole, our national secretary, you're muted.
David, this was such a wonderful Saturday afternoon. I couldn't have had a better time listening to what you had to say. I think all the Hibernians got a world of knowledge today, which I don't think they really anticipated as much as I did. It was such a great afternoon, and thank you for your research and where you've come from and what you've given us. It is just wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jerry. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Liam.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. What a terrific event. What a way to remember, honor, and celebrate the Irish and how they've contributed to the United States, but that war. And I guess one quick question, if I can ask, is the numbers of Irish born who participated in the Civil War is staggering, and you covered that in the beginning of our talk. But the number of generals, Irish born, right? What do you think contributed to that? Is it I don't know, any kind of strategic training or will the fight?
I mean, they probably should have had more. Them and the Germans. I think. I mean, there has been analysis done of this. You were less likely to get promoted in the military if you were German or Irish than if you were native born. But you know, there are significant, and they're not mentioned, that significant number of generals, it must be said, who weren't born in Ireland but were of Irish descent. People like Kearney, for example. But yeah, some of them were particularly impressive, and I think that kind of led to the likes of Smith going up the ranks, who I mentioned, Tom Smith. Like Marr obviously had to become a general because of his ability to bring in the brigade. Like so you get a lot of those kind of guys who have an ability to bring people in with them. Corcoran has that ability, for example, as well. But then other guys like Tom Smith, there's another one, Patrick Henry Jones, 154th New York Infantry, Cattaraugus County. He's just a brilliant commander. He migrates from the Midlands in Westmeath, and he actually misses Gettysburg, but he goes all through the war, and is really, really competent. There's some great characters all through it. Tom Sweeney, the one-armed general who gets into a fight with his commanding officer outside Atlanta. He attacks him with one arm. Classic Irish move. County Cork. Tom Sweeney was a big Fenian. Smith, who dies, by the way, at the end of the war. It's been a pity he hasn't had more recognition as well. And it's kind of a bit surprising because Smith was a big Fenian too, and probably would have played more of a role in the Fenians after had he not died. But yeah, I do think there's something to be said for the conviction that a lot of them have in relation to it. But again, there has been a very strong focus on kind of the likes of Marr for obvious reasons. I mean, he's a very compelling character and he deserves a lot of focus. But it's these other guys are really, really fascinating to look at as well. So great. Yeah, so there probably should have been more, but you know, there's those guys are pretty interesting.
Well, yeah, thank you again, and I'll mention as Danny mentioned as well. We'll talk to you on Monday evening for the event that's facilitated by the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, and the event is titled Capital District Irish in the U.S. Civil War. Again, we're with Damien, and I shared the link there. So if anyone's interested, they could send an email to that, a note to that to get the Zoom link. So we look forward to hearing more. And we heard a lot today about Cork, which is great. We're hoping to hear more about Kerry on Monday night.
I'll have to throw a Kerry guy in there for you. So
terrific event all around. Mom. Yeah, well, Dr. Elizabeth Stack is from Kerry as well. So yeah, so we look forward to it. So we're honored to be with you, Damien. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to it. Cheers, Liam.
I just have to put out that Father
Cosgrove.
Yeah, I just have to get a word in that Father Corby was a descendant of Awfully, so I just want to kind of put that in there.
Any closing comments on folks? Neil Cosgrove, since I've been involved with the Ancient War Hibernians, has done a great job with Irish American Heritage Month. And during this time of pandemic, he raised it to new levels. And if you needed any information of something to do during Irish American Heritage Month, all you had to do is look at our newsletter and see everything that Neil put out, the articles on that went out daily and are still going out daily, the 2 videos. Just tremendous work, Neil. I just want to thank you and
thank you
all together and recognize you for. I just couldn't be doing this without Neil. Chairman Dan Taylor, closing comment.
Thank you, Danny. Damien, I just want to thank you not only for the presentation today, but for your many years of work in telling this story and putting together the facts and figures that really let us know the magnitude of the involvement and the contribution of the Irish in our American Civil War. And just one last time, I would plug the website, IrishAmericanCivilWar.com. To our viewers, you could lose yourself in there for hours and days and find out just remarkable, amazing information throughout the website. So thank you again very much, Damien.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks so much for you all for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Damien, you knocked it out of the park.
You could join that website as a sponsor, which will really help it continue to grow and continue to be there for us. I know the National Board is going to make a donation to that website because that allows Damien to expand what he has on out there, and we're pretty excited about that. And before I give it to Damien for his last word, I want to recognize Chris Cook from the Irish Brigade today, our resident musician on the board, who also has an incredible talent with IT. I tell him something yesterday or tomorrow, and he has it done today. As I laid on him today that we finalized the event for next Saturday, and he'll, I'm sure, have that up and ready to go on YouTube before we can shake a stick at it. Thank you, Chris. Any thoughts from North Carolina?
Yeah, I was actually looking on the IrishAmericanCivilWar.com site and looking forward to reading an article on there on Captain James Fleming's letters in regards to his stay at Hatteras Inlet. So nice tie-in to North Carolina.
Excellent. Damien, thank you so much on behalf of our entire membership. This is one of those events that we'll have on YouTube that'll, I think, get a lot of play, not just this year, but moving forward. And I'm sure as I see the look in Dan Taylor's and Neil's eyes, that I'm sure we're going to have some other specific events that we'll be able to bring you on for in the future. And we're going to look forward to that friendship and relationship. But any thoughts as we end the day?
Oh, I just want to thanks Danny, and thanks to Dan and Neil and everybody for the invitation. I always enjoy speaking about the Irish and the American Civil War, and I should say no matter what time. It's one thing to talk about the Irish and the American Civil War.
Well, that's good to know. We're definitely weeknights sometimes are better than on weekends, especially as Judge mentioned, the weather's a lot nicer today than we anticipated when we put this together.
Yeah, no, but always happy to. But I really appreciate it, particularly an illustrious sort of organization like yourselves, with history that the organization has even during the war. So, yeah, just really delighted to do it, and glad that everybody enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, and most importantly, all our viewers, thank you for being on today. We hope to see you tomorrow for the Moore Street event, and next weekend we'll be live again with Lincoln and the Irish. So thank you all, and God bless.
We'll fight and fall beneath its folds like Irish volunteers. Then raise the harp of Erin, boys, the flag we all revere. We'll fight and fall beneath its folds like Irish volunteers. When I was driven from my home by Anna Purser's hand, I cut my sticks and greased me brogues and came o'er to this land. I found a home and many friends and some that I love dear. The jabbers, I'll stick to them like bricks in an Irish volunteer. Then fill your glasses up, me boys, and drink a hearty cheer to the land of our adoption and the Irish volunteers. Then fill your glasses up, me boys, and drink a hearty cheer to the land of our adoption and the Irish volunteers. Now when the traitors in the south commenced a warlike raid, I quickly then laid down my heart to the devil with my spade. To a recruiting office then I went that happened to be near, and joined the good old 69th like an Irish volunteer. Then fill the ranks and march away, no traitors do we fear. We'll drive them all to blazes, says the Irish volunteer. Then fill the ranks and march away, no traitors do we fear. We'll drive them all to blazes, says the Irish volunteer. Of Wales came over here and made a hubbub. Oh, everybody turned out, you know, in gold and tinsel too. But then the good old 69th didn't like these lords or peers. They wouldn't give a damn for kings, the Irish volunteers. We love the land of liberty, its laws we will revere. But the devil take a nobility, says the Irish volunteer. We love the land of liberty, its laws we will revere. The devil takes nobility, says